The Burrell Building, Glasgow. Architects Alan Dunlop and John Meunier talk about the building's origins, development, and recent renovation and interventions. Part 1, Site and Context.
Hello, my name is Alan Dunlop. I'm an architect and an educator. Welcome to the first of 3 podcasts where I'm delighted to talk to John Meunier. John is an internationally published architect and educator and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's taught at Cambridge, Cincinnati, and Arizona State University, where he was both professor and dean, and was the president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture in the USA. He was a visiting professor at Harvard and Yale and was interim director of the School of Architecture at Clemson University in South Carolina. Now an emeritus professor of architecture at Arizona State University. John has homes in the USA and Arizona, and in the UK just outside Cambridge. Barry Gasson and John Meunier with Britt Anderson, while teaching at Cambridge University, won the architectural competition to design the Burrell Collection Gallery in March 1972. The Burrell in Pollok Park, Glasgow, houses the art collection of Sir William Burrell. The building opened in 1983. It is Category A listed, one of the very few post-war buildings in Scotland to be so. Historic Environment Scotland describe it as being of special architectural interest. Welcome, John. Thank you for spending this time with us. Can you describe how you met and began working with Barry and with Britt?
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I'm sorry that went on so long. It all really began in Cambridge, where all 3 of us taught at the School of Architecture at the university. I arrived there in 1962, flying in pretty well from Munich in Germany, where I was working at the time. I discovered very early on that I was, with the help of the university, in a position to design and build a house. So I designed and built a house, and that house was widely published in architectural magazines and the popular press. And as a result of that, I was commissioned to design another house for a Mr. John Wendon in a nearby village. I've always enjoyed working with other people, and I'd met Barry, who had joined the faculty a year or so after I did, and I thought it would be fun to do that together with him. So we worked together and designed a house that ultimately was exhibited in the Paris Biennale in 1967, having been chosen by the British Council as an example of what British architecture was producing at the time. And that started Barry and I on our career. We did several other houses and a couple of things for Cambridge colleges, and ultimately a sports pavilion for the University of Essex. So we were in practice together for the best part of a decade. My contract, like Barry's, was a term contract. In other words, we were hired for a limited number of years, and there was no expectation of continuation. However, Leslie Martin, who was the professor at the time, seemed to see something in me that he liked, so he invited me to transfer to a tenured position at Cambridge. That didn't happen for Barry, and so he began to think about what else he could do. And at that time, the Burrell competition brief was published. So Barry went by train up to Glasgow. I had a good look at the site and had very important ideas that came out of that, and formally entered the competition on his own. Realized eventually that he couldn't on his own finish the full presentation. And so he asked me, as his previous partner, to rejoin him, which I did. And we made that first presentation. It was a 2-stage competition, and a very large number, I think over 200 and something entrants came in. We were lucky enough to be selected for the 6-team playoff for the competition. Now, about that time, Britt Anderson also arrived at Cambridge. She didn't arrive until 1971, but in a very similar situation to us. She was teaching on a term contract at Cambridge. And she also joined the team for the second stage of the competition. And as you know, we won that in 1972. So we met as colleagues at Cambridge University. One of the nice things was true about Cambridge at that time was that the faculty was encouraged to practice. Research, of course, is one of the things that you're expected to do at the university. But at that time, Cambridge also encouraged what they called creative activity, as well as research, and so we practiced as well. So that's the beginning of the story.
You mentioned there, John, about working with Leslie Martin, a very influential architect, educator. Can you say a bit about what the architectural scene in the UK was like at that time when Leslie Martin came to Cambridge?
Well, one of the great things, of course, of Leslie coming to Cambridge is that Cambridge itself began to employ very good architects. And that was, so Cambridge began to be part of the scene. The scene was dominated by London, and I'd never spent much time in London. I did do an internship when I was a student at Liverpool with Hugh Casson in London, but I'd never really been a part of London. Barry and I were actually at universities outside London, outside Cambridge. I was at Liverpool, he was at Birmingham. Both of us had American second degrees. I went on to Harvard, he went on to Columbia. So to say we were sort of came out of the British scene isn't really quite true. And now, obviously, as students, we were very much part of it. And I always talk about one of the things I did as a student when I was working for Hugh Casson. I went to an exhibition at the Whitechapel Art Gallery called This Is Tomorrow, a very, very important exhibition organized by Theo Crosby, who incidentally was one of the assessors for the Burrell competition. And at that exhibition, Jim Sterling presented, but perhaps the most impressive presentation that I saw was one by Peter and Alison Smithson and Paolo, what's his name? The Italian artist and sculptor. It was called Patio and Pavilion. And one of the phrases that accompanied that was the idea of dragging a rough poetry out of the quotidian. In other words, out of the everyday, we can drag a rough poetry. That became a kind of theme for me, and certainly was part of the driving force of the ideas behind my own house. Of course, when we got to Cambridge, we began to be part of the scene. And as I say, Leslie had persuaded the university to hire some very good architects. And one of those was Jim Sterling. Now, Jim Sterling, I thought, had been a very, very important player. He had declared a kind of independence from an alliance with the work of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Alvar Aalto, that tended to dominate architecture in England. In fact, both Jim Sterling and the Smithsons in their early buildings showed an allegiance to that. But the Leicester Engineering Laboratory showed a fresh, new and important development, and I think was very important. He went on, of course, to do a history faculty building at Cambridge, which was also very influential on us.
When people talk about the Burrell Building, John, they talk about its Scandinavian influences. But you and I have talked before that the influence, well, can you talk a bit about the architectural influences on the approach to the design and the building, particularly the Glaswegian influence and any Scottish influences?
Two of the things that Barry and I agreed on was that the springboard for a work of architecture should be formed from two components. One is the site and the context, not just the immediate context, but the larger context, and the program. I had also been an associate of Alexander when I was at Harvard, and he was very, very interested in the idea that the program should be a generator, as was John Summerson in a very important speech he gave in 1958 at the RIBA. So the site and the program were the springboards for our work on the Burrell, as they were for all of our work. The site, of course, was two things. One was this beautiful park, Pollock Park, but the other was the city of Glasgow, and as you mentioned, was tremendously important to us. Both Barry and I had studied at cities that grew mightily in the 19th century, Liverpool and Birmingham. Glasgow, of course, is also a city that grew mightily in the 19th century. And two of the buildings that I freely admit were very influential on us were the Kibble Palace, one of those marvelous steel and glass manifestations of the development of science, an echo of the Crystal Palace in New York, and also of a glass house that was very close to where I lived in Liverpool. That idea of creating a kind of microclimate in the north of Europe, a microclimate within which things could flourish that might not flourish otherwise. And then the other thing, which surprisingly perhaps, was the Central Station Hotel in Glasgow, which is where Barry and I stayed. In fact, there was one occasion when we climbed out of our window and walked onto the roof of the Central Station, which was a glass roof, which is perhaps not irrelevant to our conversation here. But certainly Glasgow was tremendously important. And of course, one of the things you know extremely well, Alan, is that it's a city of red sandstone. And so red sandstone was tremendously important to us, as was other kinds of stone in the building of the building. Barry and I, as I said, had worked in America, so it was far more likely that it would be American influences rather than Scandinavian influences. Where the Scandinavian comes from, I'm not quite sure. There was a tendency, I think, for all critics to see if they could fit the building into a box, a recognizable category, if you like. And I think one of the things that people have found very frustrating is which box does the Burrell fit in? They really don't know. And I think the reason for that is that it was never designed to fit in a box.
Can you explain a bit more, John, about your thinking about the site in Pollock Park and your approach to the brief, and also include the various stages of development?
Well, as I said, Barry made his own initial visit to the site. And I've always accepted the notion that Barry deserves the vast majority of the credit for the building, no question about it. And one of the reasons he deserves that credit is that on his visit to the site, he made a very, very important discovery, which was that this beautiful meadow, sloping meadow in Pollock Park, which was made available for the competition, sloped up to a rather strong, high position. And I think everybody sort of expected that the museum would be sited to command that site. Barry discovered something which was very, very important, which was that the band of trees around the site offered a relationship to a building that might work extremely well. One of the things that I've noted, and that we never talked about this, it's just in retrospect, Barry worked for Philip Johnson in New York, and one of Philip Johnson's most important buildings was his own glass house in New Canaan. When I went to visit that building, I recognized that what was important was not just the building, but the trees around the building. They were very, very important. In fact, they were so important that Johnson always floodlit the trees at night so that when you were in the house, you weren't surrounded by shiny glass walls, but you were surrounded by beautiful spotlit trees. And I think whether that was or not, it seems to me a rather good precedent for what Barry thought might work, which was for the museum to actually look into the trees to the north of the museum. Art studios, of course, have always had great big windows to the north. Artists like the unvarying light from the north. So the museum basically echoed what an artist's studio might be like. It had great big windows to the north, but it looked into dense trees. And looking into dense trees had this huge advantage that it lowered the light level. Now, that sounds a strange thing. If you want to see a lot of art, you want to lower the light level. But art is damaged by bright daylight. The infrared and the ultraviolet are extremely bad for any organic material in artwork. So getting the light level down, but still enjoying the natural light was one of the things that that site offered, and Barry discovered that. Now, the other thing, of course, we haven't talked about is the program. It was a terrific program, a really wonderful program, developed by this group of professional assessors working with the people responsible for the Burrell. The Burrell collection, of course, has been given to the city of Glasgow. So the city of Glasgow put up this competition. A fantastic collection of a very, very wide array of stuff, from 700 pieces of beautiful stained glass through to magnificent French Impressionist paintings, magnificent bronzes and ceramics from all over the world, and very particularly some beautiful tapestries and carpets. So it's a very wide-ranging collection. And one of the things that became clear to us was that this collection would require and take advantage of very different conditions. Some of the collection would need to be very, very protected from the damage of harsh light. Some of it, the stained glass, would welcome having sunlight behind it. But the carpets and the tapestries would need to be in much, much darker spaces. So we designed the building to have a rich array of contexts within which art could nestle. The other thing that the brief suggested was that we needed to consider the different kind of visitors that would come to the museum. There would be the visitor who only had an hour to spare and wanted a quick look at the exhibit. There would be the visitors who wanted to spend a day or so fully exploring as much of the exhibit as they could possibly find. There was going to be the visitor who needed to be able to go specifically and directly to a particular work because he or she was very, very interested in that. And then, of course, there were the actual students and the researchers. And the students and the researchers needed access to storage and so on. So we designed the building basically on 3 levels. A main level, which most of the visitors would stay on. A mezzanine level where you could put the very large collection of prints, drawings, and photographs. And then a basement where the storage could be, which could only be visited by a request by somebody doing research. Then on top of that, it was a very complete museum. It had a restoration suite, and that went way up in the roof where it could take advantage of very, very clear light. It had a home for visiting scholars. It had classrooms for people to study in. And of course, the whole administration needed to be housed. But I think by dint of a lot of hard work during the 2 stages of the competition, we managed to organize it into a very logical, rational, and actually very elegant plan. I remain very, very happy. Every time I look at that plan, I think it's an exquisite thing in its own right.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you. I mean, not only the plan, but the section 2, John, are remarkable. in their conciseness and their clarity. It's an incredibly beautiful work in plan and section.
Next episode, a thoroughly modern building.